All right, let's drop into another episode of Second Nature. We are joined today by Darren Rayner, who is the head of creative and founder of Magnifier. And what I think is going to be epic about this episode specifically, we talk all the time about content, but we specifically reference athlete content. And we haven't talked a ton about brand content. And Darren, this is like your bread and butter. You are the absolute OG when it comes to brand content. And I think a lot of people that work at brands are going to take a ton away from this discussion today. So, welcome to the pod.
Yeah, appreciate it, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
So, could you give me just a little bit of the founding insight of how you started Magnifier? What was sort of the thing that led you into brand social?
Sure, yeah. Prior to Magnifier, I owned with a couple other fellows. I owned this clothing brand called Valeurs, and and we would make these annual action sports films. These are like 45-minute films: ski, snowboard, a little bit of mountain biking, a little bit of skateboarding, all kind of like West Coast, Pacific Northwest, good times vibes. Um, and I was noticing, a long time ago, probably 2005, that our short assets started to perform better on whatever platform we were on, every platform that it was available at that point. But our short form stuff was like really performing really well, and it started to grow more so than our longer form content. And that sounds so normal today, but that was like the a kind of a pivotal moment in my mindset, that I kind of thought that maybe producing more bite-sized content, 30 seconds to 3 minutes, was a direction that we should go with a company, and that was also a direction that we were going with our partners as well. And we started to see kind of demand from clients like Red Bull, that's what they wanted, that's what they were looking for. So we kind of pivoted to that direction.
It's interesting that you really leaned into it, where I think the knee jerk reaction for a lot of people that are filmmakers or are out there making videos, they almost get bummed when their short stuff outperforms their long form stuff. But you probably had a little bit of a different approach to it, I would imagine.
Yeah, like I felt, early on, it felt great to be able to entertain people, even if it was for a short time. Entertain, inspire, educate. So it felt like we were tapping into something that wasn't so tapped at that point in time. And yeah, it feels good when people are watching your content and enjoying it. And that's kind of what sparked things.
I've got to imagine that your approach to the whole thing probably had a lot to do with the intention that you put into making short form content, where a lot of the other brand social that you see back then and even sometimes today is still a bit of an afterthought of like, oh, well, we shot this thing social. Can you just make this go viral for us, please? Um, if I had a dollar every time somebody was like, can you make it go viral? Or I'm sure you've been in plenty of those meetings as well. But I think it's interesting the difference of, hey, we shot this long form piece, figure out how to like cut some puzzle pieces out of it, versus sort of being short form focused or intentional about creating that content to perform on the place that you're actually sharing it, right?
Yeah, I think you've got to think of it all. Like if you're going out and shooting a longer form, brand, like say documentary branded entertainment piece, could be 20 minutes, could be an hour. Like if you're going out and shooting that, you definitely need to put a ton of your efforts into like how that shows up on social, because you're putting yourself, you're putting filmmakers and you're putting athletes and people in the situations, essentially in the environment, to produce these long form content. That's like such a gold mine for producing short form social first content. And so, I mean, that's kind of like our approach is the hero asset is important, but the shoulder assets and the social first assets have just as much of an important, and in many cases deliver a significant increase in views and reach and engagement and all that stuff.
Could you go a little bit deeper on I'm sorry, shoulder content? I know I'm familiar with the term, but maybe a lot of people don't know what you mean when you say shoulder content with regard. So hero content's like the main piece, the film, the big project piece, but what maybe for the audience is shoulder content?
Yeah, sure. So we've got an approach that we call the content pyramid. And essentially, while you're shooting the hero asset, you've also got a game plan to deliver social first shoulder, what we call shoulder assets, and these can be content pieces that drive attention to the hero, but like more times than not, we actually produce shoulder assets that are net new. We're just using the environment, the shoot day, the set day, the people that are there. We're using that opportunity to create product education pieces behind the scenes, brand like more short form branded entertainment, content that can look and feel totally different than the hero asset, but leveraging the shoot day to deliver essentially more content for no extra for minimal extra effort.
That BTS is an absolute gold mine. When you're behind the scenes on a shoot like that, where you're doing some big project, but you aren't giving up the ender clip in the piece of content, but you're
Hmm.
building the excitement, building the anticipation. There's so much to work with there, especially if you're working with athletes and you can show it through their point of view or show their experience or tell a story about like what else happened in the context of that moment, what was the lead up to it, or whatever.
Hmm.
It's one thing to show the big backflip, but what were they thinking beforehand? Or maybe things were not looking good, and then all of a sudden everything turned around. Like there's so many little storylines that you can kind of mine for that level of content when you're intentional and when you're brought in that early in the process too. Because again, a lot of times this style of content has been viewed as sort of an afterthought from the brands that are trying to put it out. Oh, we shot this cool thing. Can you make a shorter version of it? What are the
Hmm.
what do those conversations look like when you're talking to brands? I've got to imagine the brands like Arcteryx and Red Bull that you talk to kind of have a pretty good understanding of what you do. But in the early days of some of those brand conversations or any other brands that you're talking to, what does that look like when you're trying to explain, hey, this is what we do and why we do it?
Hmm. Yeah, like I think having like a deep understanding of a brand, the brand identity, the brand voice, and their and our partners' goals is like a great place to start. So defining that really helps drive our creativity and our concept development. So if we can clearly understand what a brand is attempting to achieve, then developing concepts developing shoulder assets around a hero asset becomes like pretty second nature, if you could say that. Um,
Nice.
and yeah, so that's kind of our approach, is just getting educated, discovery, understanding what brands want, and then delivering concepts that speak to their audience or the audience they're trying to reach and perform well on social. It's like we need to tick those two boxes um, for every piece of content we create.
The other thing that I'm kind of thinking about too when it comes to having a really positive and strong social first program, whether it's with the athletes or the brands themselves, a lot of times when you post these hero assets, the comments that you're getting are like, wow, epic, awesome, whatever emoji, right? But I feel like when you post this really meaningful BTS style footage, you get a different kind of feedback from the audience. And a lot of times, specifically in the brand's case, you're talking about maybe a product on its own. And I think what a lot of people probably are missing is that you can get some really interesting product feedback from your audience directly in a way that you wouldn't get if you had posted only the hero asset or only a cut down of the hero asset. Does that ring true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a few things to unpack there, but like social media can be used as like a testing ground to get educated, essentially. Like brands should think of it more as like a lab, like a lab to test, to ask questions, to see what's resonating with people. And you can use data, you can use comments to kind of drive your next step. But I also think talking about like that, the awe factor and like the wow factor of content, there's so much stuff out there that's just like so much wow and so much like so it's so grand that it's like kind of almost a lot of it's like hard to really grasp, it's hard to really understand. And I think audiences are leaning a bit more into like relatability right now. Like, what can I actually relate with? What can I relate to? Like,
Mhm.
can I understand what I'm watching? I think both have a place in online, but being a relatable brand is, I think, really important.
What about athletes? Because I think a lot of these top tier athletes that the big brands are working with are aspirational, but are they relatable? I mean, how do you manage that part of the equation? Or maybe how do you think about working with these aspirational athletes when it comes to this kind of content?
I think both, like, again, it kind of comes back to like developing a hero asset that could potentially be the more aspirational brand anthem, and then developing your 5 questions with, with DK Metcalf, for example, um, or yeah, 3 things you didn't know about a certain athlete, and like developing that concept. So I think it's important to try a lot of things and see what's resonating, but it's often the relatable content that's more like easier to like understand from an audience perspective. What I feel is performing right now.
When you're working with a brand, you just mentioned the concept of formats, right? Where you have 3 questions, 5 questions, whatever. Is that sort of your traditional approach where you come in and try to develop out sort of 5 formats that might work in multiple cases that you can kind of rinse and repeat over the next couple months? Or are you trying to pitch more one-off stuff for like a specific brand asset? How do you think about kind of coming in and building up a social program for a brand?
That's a great question. I think, once we've done a bit of a discovery phase, we develop a strategy based on which platforms they're trying to, which audiences on which platforms they're trying to communicate with. And so the communication that the type of communication we develop for TikTok is different than for YouTube Shorts or YouTube long form or Instagram Reels. So we will develop like a cross-platform approach where each piece of content is optimized for each platform. And sometimes like there's not too much rinse and repeat, but sometimes our Instagram Reels content will look a bit similar to our TikTok content, but we'll just fine tune certain creative and certain song choices and even like the on-screen text to be like optimized for platform. But yeah, that's kind of like our approach.
You know, it's funny. I used to post the same reel or the same short form content on both Instagram and TikTok just to see the algorithms duke it out to see which one was going to perform the highest and how they were going to do. And it was always fascinating to me to see who's going to win today. Is it going to be TikTok or Instagram?
Yeah, yeah.
And for a while there, I think the algorithms were really similar in that the content would perform well in both places. And, it's the same person watching it, whether it's an algorithm or not, like the same, human interaction is going to happen. If it's got a compelling hook, if it's good content, if it's something that they're interested in, it should perform well no matter
Hmm.
what. But there
Hmm.
is there is a broad or there's a difference between the different things. I'd love to hear about TikTok because I think a lot of people don't really know how to approach it, don't understand the value there. It just seems like a black box to so many people. And obviously down here in the States, like it's all over the place in terms of is it going to be around or not. And I think brands rightly probably haven't invested much in it because they're just not sure what's going to happen with TikTok. And places like Instagram are a little bit safer, well, better known and better used. And this is a thing that I think is key. It's socially acceptable to look at Instagram at work. It's maybe not as socially acceptable to be watching a 10-minute YouTube video or scrolling TikTok. And so I wonder if maybe that has an outsized impact on investment from brands. But you've actually done a lot of TikTok content for Arcteryx and I think maybe Red Bull too. Could you talk a little bit about TikTok in general, maybe the strategy and kind of how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think TikTok is a really important platform to for brands to be involved with because it's like there are audiences that overlap within both, but there are net new audiences that you'll reach on TikTok, and of course, we all know the algorithm is very very strong. So it's like I see mid-size and large brands who are still not on TikTok at all, and it is a bit like I am blown away because at the bare minimum you could just start by taking your Instagram posts, throwing them on TikTok, and you will start to see performance. And once that starts to work, you could develop a net new creative for the platform. But I think TikTok's still a gold mine. I think it's a great opportunity for brand awareness and brand advocate. Like TikTok has the algorithm develops more stronger brand advocacy than other platforms. Like people if they relate to the content on that they're seeing from a brand, they'll be more likely to share it. The platform is pretty strong for building brand advocates. Um, but yeah, the unknown is the unknown, right? So it's like it's interesting. We just shot We just worked on a TikTok first campaign 2 days ago. We had a full production in the studio, um, and it nothing is happening yet. But it's like there's so much unknown. I think like our mindset is like we keep putting our best foot forward. We keep creating content and trying to help our partners achieve their goals. And whatever happens with TikTok and politics is like so far out of our control. We'll just
Yeah.
like let the universe figure that out.
There's a really big selling component that I don't think has been unlocked in, at least in the States, probably North America in total. But if you go overseas, it's a huge part. One of the conversations I was having the other day was like, oh, I feel like whenever I turn on TikTok, I'm watching the Home Shopping Network now. But I do feel like, oh, if a brand could harness that, that would be a really big deal for them. Are you seeing that with the brands you're working with, where they're getting into more of the shopping side of things, or are they purely doing it as a brand play?
Yeah, purely brand awareness at this point. And the shop, it hasn't come to Canada, and I'm not sure where it's at in the US, but it's like that's coming, and that's huge. It's had huge growth, but we haven't that hasn't been something that we've been focusing on just yet, but I'm sure it's coming.
I know YouTube is really pushing the whole YouTube shopping thing as well. So there's a big opportunity there for people to produce high level short form content and then turn that immediately into sales. Whereas I think in the past, this has always been sort of like a bonus thing like, great, more people are going to see more content. It's brand building, but we're not far off from short form driving sales. And I think maybe the conversation for people like you who are creating specific content that's short form, that will perform, that builds brands, that builds sales, probably going to get really interesting in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know you've talked about brand marketing versus performance marketing here, and that's something I'm always like trying to fine tune and grasp even deeper. But yeah, it has been hard for us to say to potential partners like, hey, we sold this much of this product,
Mm-hmm.
because like a lot of our stuff is brand awareness, brand loyalty, brand lift, and and it will be interesting if there becomes a point in time where we can actually say like, hey, our our organic content or our content has actually helped drive significant, notable, immediate sales. But yeah, a lot of our stuff is like it's all long-term plays, long-term growth goals for brands.
It's got to be tricky when you have the paid side of things because there is a very specific formula of return that they expect, whereas on a brand you don't have the same formula in place. They don't have the same sort of quantitative expectations, I would imagine, than that a performance team probably would. But what do you think about using, because like you said, social is kind of a laboratory to find out how people are interacting with your content and how they interact with the brand. Do you think there's something to be learned from high performing organic content that could pay off for performance marketing?
Yeah, so like our approach, and what we try to communicate to to a lot of our partners is to develop organic content and then look at what's performing well and take your highest performing organic content from like a, let's say it's a shoe launch and we've got 10 assets, develop those assets, put them out organically, and then the top two, run those as paid because they're performing well. You know that those are resonating with people. I think going out and developing and shooting and creating content specific for paid is not the right strategy.
Interesting. I mean, you'd probably want to make a few tweaks, like you'd maybe change the call to action on content that was working well, right? So there's some sort of like follow through.
Yeah, and like there's always going to be certain transactional content that you need to put out there if it's like a Boxing Day sale, and you need to just have certain call to action like buy now, and that totally makes sense. But one mindset that we have is yeah to essentially boost or run your highest performing organic content on paid.
I've got to imagine one of the hardest things in these discussions with brands is the turnaround time because it feels like, having worked at a brand, multiple brands before, I know how many discussions have to happen from ideation to execution. And one of the things that's really particular about social media is the rate of change in terms of trends and things that are like actually working. And so maybe an example, right? On running is running a series right now with Elmo. And like a year ago, Elmo like was on Twitter just like gassing people up, being like, "Hey, like don't be so hard on yourself. You're gonna be okay." And it was like a big moment out of the blue, right? And and now a year later, for good or bad, On is running a campaign that's like, "Don't be so hard on yourself," or something like that, related to this like really viral moment on Twitter from 365 days ago. And I think it's like, however you feel about this campaign, it's actually a signal of like, this is how long it takes to get ideas into execution at a large brand. So I'd love to hear you kind of talk about in the world that you work in where you're like quickly turning stuff around as fast as you can. How do you mitigate for that, or how do you deal with the fact that, oh, we might just miss opportunities, or we can be ahead of these by doing this, or maybe we should just set the trends? Like, what do those conversations look like?
Yeah, good question. Things move really, really fast here. And it's almost like the way we've structured our relationship with partners is to be able to move quickly, right? More of like a 12, we develop like 12-month roadmaps as an always on. This is maybe 50% of our business is like developing a 12-month roadmap as an always on creative studio. And so being able to already be an extension of their internal team means we can move super quick. The moment they want to start thinking about moving on something, because culture is shifting, like culture is always shifting. So if there's a cultural shift and their clients want to move on something, we're right there starting to kind of like come up with a plan and come up with a timeline and execute.
Are they coming to you more often than not with like, "Hey, this is the kind of stuff we want," or are you really just pitching in like, "This is what probably needs to be done"? Is it a 50-50? What is
Yeah,
that?
it's probably 50-50. Yeah, I'd say the larger the client, the more kind of internal goals they have that they want to achieve, and then we just have to bring their like broad goals and become really granular and bring them to life on social.
Mhm.
And then our mid-sized and smaller clients, we often just come up with the entire creative and the entire game plan, and they're usually just like, yeah, do it.
Like,
Yeah,
that sounds great. You
yeah,
you do that.
yeah.
I I do feel like as a smaller creator, that's a lot of the relationships that I've been building is just like come to people with ideas and say like, "Hey, can I make this thing for you? Like, I love your brand. I use your product. Here's the thing that I want to make you, and could we, partner up on something like this, because I think it'd be beneficial for you, but I also really really want to make this." Is that a lot of the conversations when you're, building your client base out? Like, is that a great approach, or do you have a different sort of path to make it happen?
Yeah, yeah. I think the ideas and the creative and the strategy is like the most crucial part of the process. Execution is challenging. Shooting, editing has its own challenges, but I think like the most crucial part, the part that's really gonna where if you put your focus on the idea, that you're gonna see the result, you're gonna see the results. So I mean, it's interesting that that's that kind of your focus, because I think that's like really important. Like we're human and we have human ideas and we understand brands. So like, how can we use our human brains to come up with ideas that resonate with a brand's audience?
I'd love to hear more about the challenges that you run into on a somewhat regular basis, and it could be anything. Pick wherever you want to go with this one, but what kind of challenges do you feel like you're dealing with an awful lot these days?
I think there was challenges with so last 2 years the challenges what was that like a lot of retail brands had like very immediate like marketing budget cuts. So we saw that, a lot of my agency friends saw that. That was our challenge the last 2 years. Now it's like I think our business challenge is to keep up with the speed of growth of the business. And then in terms of creativity, like we have these weekly meetings where we're sharing cool stuff that we're seeing online. So I think our challenge is like keeping up with like continually sharpening our creative tools. Because if we just kind of like, oh, stick with our own ways and do things the way we've always done them, we're not growing as creatives. And at the end of the day, the creativity is the most important thing for us. So sharpening our creative tools, I'd say, is like our main challenge that we're constantly working on.
I think one of the fun things that gets dropped in your lap a lot when you're doing social for brands too is when a new platform launches. So what, about a year ago, Threads came out, and or maybe it was longer than that, but stuff like that just pops up, and you're like, is this the next TikTok, or is this just gonna die out like 50 other social platforms have died out? How do you have those conversations with brands of, should we put our energy into this platform or not?
It's interesting because it really has just been like the Instagram, TikTok, YouTube trifecta for like quite some time. What happens is the focus shifts between the three of those, and then someone mentions Snapchat over here, and then we're
Mm.
like, oh, we've done that before. Um, but there hasn't been a huge shuffle recently. Not that I've seen, but yeah, initially, when TikTok really started to grow, we had to learn really quickly. We had to really like start becoming users, understand like what's the behavior on this platform, like what's resonating with people, and what do we need to know as filmmakers.
Yeah, tactically, what do you think is working best on TikTok right now?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question because I know that the platform is trying to push for a bit more and I say long form with like quotations because like what is long form anymore? Is it like 30 seconds or 30 minutes? But it's trying to push for longer form. Um, I still think like the strong hook and the shorter form content is working, but I do believe I do believe that there's a pendulum swinging back to more meaningful content and a little bit away from like memes, quick hits, quick ads, shallow content. I'm seeing a trend going towards more meaningful content that actually resonates with people, and I'm seeing that across all platforms.
There's an article that just went live today from Patrick Crawford, which I have up on my computer and have not had a chance to dig into, but it's called "The Case for Ignoring the Algorithm." And the subhead is, maybe 5-hour podcasts and newsletters are telling us something about human interest. And
Hmm.
I haven't read the article, but I mean, the depth that people want to get into this stuff, the nuance that they want, it's really hard to convey that in a 30-second video. But in a world like that, how do you feel? I mean, your specialty has been short form content. Do you feel like it reorders the way that brands are thinking about this? Will there always be need for short form content? Like, what does that do to the immediate or midterm future for what you're working on the majority of your time?
Yeah, I think there will always be a need for short form content, but I do think there's a rise in long form, and that's like music to my ears. Like that's where we came from. That's our DNA.
Mhm.
Everyone who works here was like long form documentary filmmakers before kind of taking this dive into short form. So we're excited to kind of take it wherever it goes, and if it goes to more meaningful, deeper storytelling, like we're all for it. And like one of our clients is Mountain Gazette, which I know you all talk about sometimes, and
Mhm.
like there's something to be said for picking up a magazine and reading on your couch, right? Like I think that's like it's nice to know that print isn't dead, and there's other forms of communication, there's other forms of entertainment, inspiration, and education.
Absolutely. And I think you have to have sort of that ecosystem, right? Like, it can't be one thing all the time. There has to be print, there has to be long form, there has to be short form. And I think from a brand perspective, the way that I think about all this content stuff is, what if you could operate your own TV channel? The idea of doing that prior to the internet would have been an astronomical fee to be able to own it. But the benefit of owning your own TV channel would have also been astronomical. And now the internet has democratized it in a way where actually the cost to have a TV channel is pretty low. And short form content is a way to get people to your TV channel, whether you're a brand or a creator, athlete, doesn't matter. You have this short form content as sort of like hooks to bring people in and to share the story. And the long form better be good, whether it's written or video or whatever. But you also have to do a good job with the short form, because if that's compelling enough, it's going to do the job to get them to that long form content. And I think you're right. The long form specifically, I've been seeing a lot on YouTube where they're really prioritizing this overall session time. So it's not just like, you know, you click watch one video and then you leave. They want you to click and stick, as my friend Jake says. And that can be that you're surfacing up an hour-long video that's a podcast like this or a documentary piece, or it could be that you've put out a series of like 10 really amazing videos that somebody uncovers your stuff, likely from short form, and then sticks around for the whole time. So I think you're right. It's like a really valuable part of the ecosystem for a brand or a creator or an athlete to have. And I think that there is something more to it. I think that's kind of what we've been circling around. Is like real intention when it comes to that short form content is what makes the difference. It's not just about checking a short form box. It's about actually executing on a way that's going to deliver those viewers into the wider ecosystem, whether you have print or long form or whatever else, right?
Yeah, it's all really important. And there are some brands like smaller companies that I've seen that have like essentially built their entire business off of like TikTok. And I'm sure you've seen these like TikTok brands, and it's like it seems to work, and it's a great way to start. And you've got millions of viewers. But I think as the company evolves, you can't just put all your eggs in one basket. There's no way you should be thinking about a bigger marketing mix.
What has it been like for you working with, because whenever you kind of start working with a brand, you'll have their entire roster of potentially athletes or the, content creators, influencers, however you want to call that category of people. How do you kind of integrate with those creators and athletes when you're working with them, and what does that look like for you as a brand and an agency to start working together?
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to co-author the creative with an athlete. It's really important for an athlete to have their buy-in, whether the entire project was their idea, which does happen. I mean, look at most Red Bull projects; it was likely from the athlete, um, or whether it's more so that they're just like having sign off and they're kind of helping drive the direction of the creative. But it's really important to have athlete buy-in in all of our athlete driven projects, and those are the ones that perform the best. Like our highest performing piece of athlete driven content, or our highest performing piece of content, hands down, was a project with snowboarder Seb Toots, and it was his idea.
Was that the one where he was like in the gym, like jumping over stuff and then running, right? It was like not even a snowboard clip. It was just like a crazy sort of like behind the scenes training thing.
Yeah, gymnastics meets like kind of snowboard vibe.
Yeah, with a little bit of Rube Goldberg in there too, I think.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
That's really fun. And yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people maybe don't catch when it comes to Red Bull. Like of course you have these athletes doing interesting and high performance things, but there's this project mentality at Red Bull where it's not just about winning stuff, but it's about expanding the sport or doing something that really engages an audience in a way other than what you can do on a podium. And that's where the creativity really comes in. And if there's anything I miss about working at Red Bull, it was the kind of creative outlet of working with athletes to come up with those ideas. My BPC today is actually related to that, but we'll get to that in a
Oh,
little while.
nice.
We talked a little bit also about performance marketing. We talked a little bit about brand, but what is sort of the shift that you're seeing here when it comes to those two things? Because I think we've seen the formula for performance marketing and the meta ads and all that stuff that have come out and really have been working well to build brands up. But what is sort of the evolution of that going to look like in 2025, do you think?
In terms of performance and advertising and
Yeah,
meta.
I guess like in when it comes to short form, do you see the emphasis changing either into a different kind of performance marketing? Do you see it shifting more into brand, like using that same meta ad space to build the brand as opposed to selling product? What's kind of your take on what's going to evolve in that space?
Think I It feels like brands overextended with the rise of D2C and with COVID. Like a lot of companies overextended on like quick results, quick hit, quick advertisements, immediate ROI, which is like what performance is great for. But I just hear like I'm hearing just like a lot of complaints about ads not working and Meta not driving the results that people want, and it feels like the pendulum is swinging back a bit more towards longer term brand marketing, which you don't see results immediately. And yes, there can be a bit harder to track, but I am seeing a lot of brands starting to focus in that direction more and more as the performance marketing feels like it hasn't quite worked as it did 3 years ago. Now, I think you need both. You never just go like all or nothing on one or the other, but it's like it's almost like it's going 70-30 and then 70-30 the other direction now.
It does seem in that scenario, you could hear a brand maybe start to experiment in different places like TikTok where they maybe hadn't been before. I know you've done a fair bit of work with Arcteryx, and there's a case study on your page from Magnifier where you talk about more about that process and like how you got them into TikTok and really built up their channel and stuff. Could you go a little bit deeper on what that looked like to really spin up their TikTok channel and the thought process behind it and the execution of it?
Yeah, so definitely all credit to Reed Holm, who's spearheaded that project with Magnifier, and what the strategy has been, you know, for the first I think 3.5 years working with Arcteryx was to resonate with a TikTok audience first, to deeply resonate with a TikTok audience first, and not necessarily be like totally on brand for Arcteryx. Now, some of the stuff was, but it was really like leaning into like fun, lighthearted humor, the brand making fun of itself, um, and yeah, just like being entertaining essentially, and it works super well. Um, and what we've been seeing recently is a bit more of a shift of a focus towards being a bit more on brand and like leaning into like the brand voice and the visual identity of Arcteryx. And I'm seeing this across other clients as well. So that's like the pivot that we've been making now. So it's you know it's always evolving. But those initial 3 years was really leaning into creating TikTok first content.
Was that difficult for you though when you're trying to tell Arcteryx that they need to be funny on a different platform that maybe they've not been on before? And because I've got to imagine that that discussion is like, well, we have to establish our brand. We have to be 100% consistent across all platforms. The idea that you would go on a new platform and give people a completely different brand experience feels so disconnected, even though it was right for TikTok. What was that conversation actually like?
Well, I think it's because we started with a blank slate. We kind of were, you know, again, Reed was like trying new things and we were leaning, and then we started to lean into like what was resonating the most.
Mhm.
And if things are working and they're seeing results, then, you know, they were happy and it was like entertaining for everyone. So, yeah.
That's interesting. The Red Bull social media developed that exact same way where at in Austria or with the overarching global HQ, there were rules for everything when I first got there. Branding at an event had to look a certain way. Athletes had to be branded a certain way. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do this. There was a very strict guideline for almost everything. But social media and Instagram didn't exist when I got to Red Bull. And when it did land on the scene, there were a handful of people within Red Bull that kind of took it and started building out. And the original Red Bull handle, from what I remember, came from the US. And in fact, a Second Nature listener, Andrew Nystrom, was one of the people that was leading the charge with it. And at that time, there weren't guidelines for it because it didn't exist. So the global HQ hadn't recognized it as something that needed guidelines, and that gave this team like a running start to go and develop best practices and show the value in it and show what could be done by representing the brand. Now, I think they did a great job of actually showing Red Bull as Red Bull on social media, and probably the brand was pretty teed up for success already with all like the crazy footage and projects, and like they were social media before social media existed in a way. But because there were no rules, they could go and like develop the best practices, create the trends, do the things that needed to be done so that by the time the global team got around to making the rules, they'd already established like, well, this is working. You should probably let us go, which feels very similar to that Arcteryx conversation of like, hey, this is actually working best. You should probably just let us run with this because yeah, it works.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it.
And you've done doing a fair bit of work with Red Bull as well. Do you have any favorite projects outside of that Seb one?
Yeah, you know what? Um, in Quebec City, this is a few years ago, we produced this kind of like 2.5 minute piece with a mountain biker Finn Isles, um, called Purest Line, and he essentially like Finn's like he enters into kind of like a laser focused dream state, in his mountain biking and his racing because he races at the UCI World Cup, and he we kind of filmed this like laser focused dream sequence of him mountain biking, but he was mountain biking through the streets of Quebec City, which is like this very urban kind of like old European looking, city here in, in the east coast of, or not here but in the east coast of Canada. And that was like super exciting because we had to close the streets of like one of the busiest cities in June, the busiest time of the busiest city. So it was like logistically so challenging. And we had all these people closing the streets, and we only had like 90 seconds where we could hold traffic and hold people. And we, our shoot days were like 3:30 a.m. and wrapped by like 6:30 a.m., where we just had light from, yeah, I think light was kind of like 4:45 or 5 a.m., for an hour and a half each day. But that was a super exciting project. I think probably just because it was like high stakes and like kind of like stressful, and I feel like I like that. But that was a really exciting project for us here.
Was that a social first project, or was that something you were shooting for YouTube and then you did cut downs that were, done appropriately for that?
Yeah, it was for YouTube, and then yeah, it was for YouTube, and then cut downs, and then it ended up on the news, of course, because it's like crazy mountain biker races down the streets of Quebec City during like tourist season.
I think one of the things that's the hardest about making the short form content out of something that's been filmed horizontally is just all the keyframing of it, making sure that you can actually take something that was shot in a horizontal rectangle and making it into a vertical rectangle can be the hardest part about actually making it relevant. And I think why now you're probably shooting a lot more social first is for exactly that reason. Like the framing is just different, and it's, you don't have to fit, a round peg in a square hole kind of thing when it comes to creating that content. So it's got to be a little bit more. What were there other social assets that came out of that you guys were shooting specifically for?
Yep, and well, we've got two full camera rig setups here. One's always vertical, one's horizontal.
Cool.
It's pretty funny. The horizontal one's kind of entertaining because it's like all the buttons, everything's like sideways. But the team's built it like to be really nice and ergonomic. But yeah, we like sometimes if we're shooting for all formats, we've just got these like on our monitors, we've got these scopes. So we can see if we're shooting 16:9, we can see what the vertical will look like. And that's like for sure a new challenge that we're constantly trying to work on, is like how do we make sure everything just looks good
Yeah.
everywhere across all platforms?
One other thing that I think is a huge trend when it comes to content is now the development of stuff like Sora. There's AI that can make super hyper realistic video. And I guess it's probably impossible to replicate currently what an athlete can do. But with so many other elements, AI is now kind of creeping in. How has that affected what you guys are doing as an agency, or the content that you're trying to capture?
It's something we keep a close eye on for sure. Um, we've always we've always focused on telling real stories with real people. Um, and so we'll never use generative AI to like fake a profile on an athlete. Um, um, so that, I mean, that's good for us, but it's like, it's interesting. It's changed. The landscape's changing really quickly, and especially people in like scripted commercials or, anything scripted. Yeah, things are changing. It feels like really quickly.
The one area where I think it is actually really useful is in the pitch decks themselves, where you're trying to get a concept across, but a concept's never been done before. How do you show that in an image to the client to say like, yeah, this is what it would look like if we were to do this project, for example. And I think you could probably find a billion uses for generative AI to sort of give an example of what it might look like if you were able to do this big project, and especially for sort of some of the crazier Red Bull style ideas, is probably relatively useful as a supplemental, almost like a somebody who's like sketching it out, like a sketch artist, like this is what we're thinking. Any other big trends that you're seeing in content these days that are kind of worth keeping an eye on, either on the AI side or just like weird stuff that you see kind of happening that you're keeping an eye on, stuff that brands are doing, or just non-brands but creators?
Yeah, there seems to be a big trend towards like obscure and weird and unexpected content and marketing initiatives. Um, and this is an attempt for brand, like there's so much content out there, everyone's got a camera. So this is an attempt for brands to try to stand out. And you're seeing it with that Mountain Dew Super Bowl commercial with Seal, on a
Yeah,
rock, singing to seals on a rock. It's like so quirky and strange and random, but pretty entertaining. And then, like Nutter Butter on TikTok, is like very weird, and everyone's just trying to figure out what they're even talking about. Um, and then yeah, I mean, I even loving what Jacquemus is doing, where it's like, I think it was a year or two ago where everything was like oversized for one of their campaigns. Um, yeah, it feels like brands are leveraging the unexpected and the obscure and the oversized in order to draw attention.
yeah. Duolingo is a brand that gets referenced all the time on TikTok, and the question I'm always asking is it is it doing anything for them? Like, it's brand recognition, and maybe when you see Duolingo on your TikTok, it's a reminder that you haven't opened the app yet today to practice your Spanish or whatever. But do you think that stuff is working? I mean, they're very committed to execution and committed to the strategy, but what do you think about, I mean, just doing wild stuff like this? I felt like half the ads in the Super Bowl this year, I felt like I was hallucinating. Um, is it working?
Yeah.
Is it worth it?
I think so, yeah. I think so. I mean, it's like for me personally, I'm like entertained by it,
Yeah.
but I think so. I mean, it's bringing brand awareness. So it's like if you're going to choose a platform that's on the realm of Duolingo, you're probably going to choose Duolingo. You're probably not going to choose the competitors because it's like you've seen it everywhere. You're probably not going to look anywhere.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'm sure I would love to see if how their revenue has increased since they became active on TikTok. However many years ago that was.
Is there anything out there that you are just dying to do that you haven't had a chance to do yet, whether a brand you want to work with or a concept, or maybe there's even a concept that kind of got away? Anything like that?
Yeah, like we're really, we came from, I guess I more so but I came from like an action sports background and I love action sports and I've done it and we continue to do some action sports. It's definitely not like most of our work. I love shooting snowboarding, but it's like pretty uncommon when I'm like actually in the backcountry these days.
Mm.
But I'm very interested in like taking kind of like our knowledge of of high energy sport and bringing that to the run space. Um, so we're currently partnering with a shoe brand, and I'm just like super eager to partner with shoe companies because I think it's like an exciting space to be in. I love running. There's a ton of trail running here. My backyard is trail running. And I think that there's like a lot of learnings from what we've done outside of run and bringing that to the run space is something I'm excited for.
I came from mountain biking, and growing up, we would watch almost exclusively BMX and skate videos to get ideas for not only how to ride and how to approach stuff, but also how to edit stuff, how to present stuff, how to interact with the world through our sport. And we took so much inspiration from those two. And I talk about this a lot on the podcast, this idea of cross pollination, where you can take the essence of something else and bring it over into a new space. And most of the time, no one's ever seen that kind of thing before, or they haven't had that kind of presentation before. And there's so much in the running space that's just ripe for, maybe disruption isn't the right word, but just like introducing these ways of thinking, these presentations, these different approaches to. There was a BMX series that I love called Road Fools, where they'd put like 12 of the best BMXers in the world together in a bus, and they'd tour through a part of the country together, and then they'd film whatever happened that day in whatever place that they were. And it was so fascinating to watch your favorite BMXers interact on video as opposed to just seeing photos of them in a magazine. And oh, wouldn't it be cool if you could do that on mountain bikes or in running or whatever? Like, what if you like put a bunch of your favorite people together, not at a race? What would that look like? There's a billion ideas like that out there that just have not been explored in the run space. And I love that idea of like bringing what you've experienced in the backcountry of snowboarding into that running space where actually it's probably like the same terrain, just one of it's covered with snow and one's not. And you could present it in a completely new way that would be fresh and new and exciting. That was always one of the fun parts about Red Bull too. You'd have these athletes coming together from such different disciplines and comparing notes, and then you'd see that kind of knock-on effect of like the way that an athlete in this sport is presenting a project the following year. You can see the influence from maybe a surfer they met the previous year.
Yeah, I love the like gritty, the gritty like fisheye with the vignette, or like the 8 mil camera, or like the noisy like non-digital looking
Yeah.
stuff. Like that's, taking it back to what you're saying about skateboarding. Like skateboarding was like has been a pioneer sport in so many like cultural influences across like all industries, and still continues to be in my mind.
Yeah. The dad cam is like the hot thing now. It's
Yeah.
so funny.
Like when we shoot behind the scenes stuff, it's like we came up with this new game plan where like our behind the scenes stuff that we just make for our social is just going to be all mediums, everything. Like iPhone photo, iPhone camera, dad cam, 8 mil, like our big Sony camera, 360. Just like what we just like bring it all on set, and then one of us just runs, and it's like we put these edits together, and it's like there's like 6 different formats coming in play to create, and like slow shutter photography, time lapse. We just put all the mash and put it all together in like a 30-second mashup, and it's like we probably wouldn't do such a wild mashup of content styles for a brand because they probably have some guardrails, but that's the type of stuff we actually do for ourselves.
It's good texture to a video. Like you can't make a whole video with the death lens, the skateboarding super wide angle, but you add it in as a piece of texture and it just looks different and feels different. And I think that's your job as an agency, is to always be pushing and testing and trying and seeing what's actually working and giving people a chance to think about things and see things differently. And that's the exciting bit, is that you can then bring that knowledge to the brands and make some pretty incredible stuff. Very cool. Well, yeah, I'm excited. I think the future of brand social is obviously bright and has you've been doing a lot of really cool stuff, and I'd encourage everybody to check out the case studies that you have on the Magnifier site are all really, really well built and put together. You get like the Arcteryx one. I spent like a while digging into that one just to see how you guys have kind of put it together, your thought process, the execution, all that kind of stuff. So I'll make sure to put
Appreciate
that
that.
I'll put that in the show notes so everybody can go check it out. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is fun. We end every single episode with this segment called BPC, which is basically like our swipe file, right? Of something cool that we
Right.
found in the category of brand, product, or content. Since you're the guest, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Yeah. Um, there's a women's shoe brand that's a startup here based in Vancouver called Hedda's. And it's been really interesting and kind of educational for me to like understand what it is they're doing and the problem they're solving. But I didn't realize that like for decades the big shoe brands have been essentially like shrinking and picking it. So like taking men's footwear, making it small, and then making it pink, and that's what women wore. Now I also didn't understand that the physiology of women's feet is like significantly different than men, and that's just my ignorance, not understanding the topic. But like, it's really cool to see a brand focusing specifically on women's shoes, women's footwear. And I've spoken with the founder, and I've learned a bit about the innovation that goes behind it. It's like it's a lot. It's a ton of innovation, a ton of metrics and measurement science. So I'm just like excited about this brand in particular about Heddas, and of course, unfortunately, I'll never be a client, a customer, or I'll never really get to like wear their shoes. But my wife really appreciates their product and is a big fan. So yeah, Heddas will be my BPC.
That's really cool. I've never heard of that, but I'm sure I'm probably not the only one. That's exciting to just to hear about a new brand that's doing something that feels obvious in hindsight of like, yeah, why doesn't that exist? And now, well, now there does. That's really cool. Well, I wanted to pick out a BPC this week that sort of relates to what we're talking about, and the best one I could come up with was a project I worked on when I was at Red Bull, and in the same vein of kind of going against the grain or against the brand to deliver something that actually ends up working. We did a project with Rafa Ortiz. He's a kayaker, and the project was called Lobster Falls. If you're not familiar, Rafa is like this amazing kayaker who like runs the gnarliest waterfalls, huge drops, gnarly this and that. But he's also kind of a funny guy, and we spent a lot of time together because he lives just outside of Hood River, and he was in Portland visiting me, and he's like, "Hey, I have an idea. I found this. I was like driving through Mexico, and I stopped at this gas station, and behind the counter they had this like inflatable lobster, like a pool toy." And I saw it, and the minute I made eye contact with the eyes of the lobster, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with this. And so I raced out to my car. I pulled all the change and every dollar I could find out of my center console, and I like ran back inside and plunked it on the counter to get the lobster. And here it is right here. I want to take this lobster off of like a 70-foot waterfall, and I want to film it.
Oh my gosh.
And if you know anything about Red Bull, like they don't do a lot of like funny stuff. Like they are very like, hey, this is the peak of the sport. We're pushing, even the projects themselves are meant to sort of push the boundaries of the sport. And so going in with like, hey, it is technically gnarly, but it's also kind of funny. Like, could we do this? And I got a ton of pushback of like, what are you doing? There's no way. We're not funding this. There was actually, I'm told, a discussion between the global team, like in a meeting that I was not even in. It was like above me, where they're like yelling at each other in German of like whether we should do it or not. Like it got, and this is like, let's be real, this is like a $5,000 project, right? Like it was not, this is not like $100,000 project, but like it just like hit this nerve where they're like, this would probably work really well. No, it's not on brand, but yeah, but it would probably like absolutely smash. We should go for it. We don't need to have that. We need to have more of this. And so basically, whoever was screaming the loudest in German won the battle, and I got my $5,000, which was not really enough to properly do this, but didn't matter because we were all just committed to it. You know, like no, we got to make this. So we go. Actually, it was on Easter Sunday. We go out to this waterfall, and Rafa does this drop in his lobster, all GoPro'd up. We had two drones, two red cameras, every possible angle. I'm filming with my phone. Like we hosed that thing down, and he completely stomped it. And like the photo afterwards of him like holding his lobster, looking up at the falls, iconic. The video comes out, instant million views, just through the roof on every platform. And it was this epic, like I told you so moment, but also like probably still to this day there are people that are grumpy about it. But it was a win, I think.
That's gold. Oh my God, that's gold. I'm gonna look at that right after this. That's like, that's the stuff I'm most passionate about, what you just did there.
Yeah, yeah, like maybe I mean, yeah, there's definitely a reasonable discussion to have, and I don't know if I'd raise my voice over it or not, but there's a reasonable discussion to have of like, is this on brand for us? And I think a lot of times like people are sort of looking for you to like switch it up every now and then or try something new. Not to say that you're gonna make all funny videos all the time, but is that the worst thing ever? Like, I don't know. Like
Yeah.
try
Pushing the
something new.
envelope a little, yeah, pushing the envelope a
Yeah.
little bit by little bit, I think is always nice.
And I think it matches who Rafa is. He's a funny dude. And it was okay for him. Like, if you'd put that on his channel, no problem at all. The fact that it went on the main Red Bull channel was the big question mark, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Are we going to pay money to make a piece of content for our channel that we don't believe fits our brand? is it worth it to us as a risk? Are people going to be like, what are you guys doing? And I still think you don't see a lot of funny stuff on their channel now. Maybe we like broke it, but whatever. It was worth it.
That's great. That's awesome, man.
But
Kudos for pulling that off.
yeah, every now and then you get to slide one of those through, and I think when it comes down to it, like this is the difficult part of being at a brand because you have the brand identity, but you have the athlete identity, and where do you draw the line of like how much of the athlete has influence over the content you're showing on the brand? It's a difficult, because maybe all of your athletes fit into one bucket. We all have this sort of look, feel, style, sense of humor, whatever. Maybe you don't. Maybe you have a variety and everybody brings something fresh to the brand, and you have to be okay to let people bring in their personality and really kind of own that part of it.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
It's tricky. It's tricky.
yeah, for sure.
Lots of
Yeah,
opinions on that kind of stuff, but
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's good. I'm glad we
that's
broke through.
Rad. Well, Darren, thank you so much for the time today. This is a really fun conversation, and I'm just glad we got to talk about brand social, what Magnifier is doing, kind of how you think about stuff, and I think there's a lot of insight in here that maybe people didn't already have. There's a lot of brands that have been nervous to try out TikTok, have been nervous to go platform first with these concepts and stuff, and I think you really kind of opened the door for a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Hopefully something to take away. And I really appreciate the conversation. This has been super fun. This has
Yeah,
been great. And and next time I'm down south in Oregon, I'll hit you up. I'd love to grab a coffee in real
yeah.
life.
There's a waterfall I know, and I'm pretty sure I know where I can get a lobster
Yeah,
pool toy. We can.
I'll shoot it. I'll shoot it for sure.
Rad. Well, I'm going to put all this stuff in the show notes that we talked about today, but I think for the audience, one of the other places that you drop a lot of gems on LinkedIn. You guys have made some really great content on there that's related to brand social. So that's something that I also definitely want to call out as kind of a next step. If you're not already following Darren on LinkedIn, go get both Second Nature and Darren in your following, and we'll go from there.
Awesome.
Cool. All right.
Oh yeah.
Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Cheers.